Square, but all squares in the city and actually throughout Egypt, in such a way as to make the free assembly of people impossible. Trees were cut down. This is an old picture from the 60s. There are some trees, and there are some fountains, and there are some benches. These were all removed. Palm trees that give no shade were planted instead. Benches were removed. Fences were put up. Police cameras were installed, not to monitor the people, but to monitor cars. What Tahrir has now been reduced to nothing more than a large traffic roundabout. This then is one of the most obvious aspects of the 18 days. We finally succeeded in taking the square and making it ours. People from all walks of life came there. Rich kids from across the river in Zamalek and teenagers from further afield in Nahya and Kirdas. Women were moving freely with not a single case of sexual harassments recorded. Copts were forming human chains to protect their fellow Muslims who are fleeing. With no single policeman in sight, there was not even one minor skirmish recorded during the 18 days. People ate together, sang together, and danced together. Above all, they expressed themselves in song and in writing and in speech. You might have noticed that I'm saying we, women, Copts, Muslims with no qualifiers, and I did not use quotation marks. You might have thought that this is crass, non-academic verbiage, but please indulge me for a while. I'm not simply wallowing in nostalgia. I'm trying to point out that something about Tahrir challenges our intellectual toolbox and requires some new ways of conceptualizing and thinking about what was happening. As my friend Samah Salim once remarked in Tahrir, we are trained to be suspicious of nationalism and nationalist discourse. We forbid our students from using the I word, identity. But was it nationalism that I felt when I found myself carrying the flag, which up to until 2011, this is the day Mubarak stepped down. This is the morning he stepped down at the end of the day. The morning started with a large demonstration. It started from Cairo University, crossed the river, and walked down Qasr Aini Street all the way to Tahrir. So was it nationalism that I felt when I found myself carrying the flag, which up to 2011 was understood only as a symbol of state sovereignty and was used by the masses only in football matches with their ultra-nationalism, xenophobia, and unbridled macho violence? Like many of my friends, and I suspect thousands of Egyptians, the flag now started to assume new and different meanings. The moment it was announced Mubarak had stepped down, that same day, at night, I had one of those deep feelings that one gets when one is confronted with the sublime, a sense of wonder that struggles to express itself verbally. It was not the news itself, but the sudden spontaneous outbursts of a slogan that was new and literally uplifting. Irfa rasak fo inta Masri. Lift up your head, you Egyptian. I remember the entire square shaking with that mantra, and I could not help but reflect on how similar it was to Nasser's famous saying, lift up your head, my brother, the age of serfdom is gone. Similar, but with a profound difference. For now, no one was shouting at us from a lofty podium, ordering us to be proud. We are now doing the commanding ourselves, and our pride stems from having succeeded not in evicting a foreign occupier, but in toppling our president. But it was not only while carrying the Egyptian flag that one was struck with this feeling that this symbol was now acquiring a new meaning. Arab flags hoisted in Tahrir also evoked this feeling. When we first saw the new Syrian and Libyan flags, and when we recognized the flags of Tunisia, of Bahrain, and of Yemen, and of course of Palestine, I remember my friends and I remarking that these flags now referred to a new sentiment. Sitting on the sidewalk one day, I thought that this sentiment of solidarity that we in Tahrir were feeling towards fellow Arabs were not derived from our belief in the famous slogan of Arab nationalism chiseled in our minds since our school days. This was not a belief in a single Arab nation with an eternal mission, Ummah Arabiyya Wahida Dhat Risala Khaled, There was no harking back to some glorious moment in the past when we were supposed to have shared a common language, a common religion, and a common ancestry. Rather, it is as if we were telling Tunisians, Libyans, Yemenis, and Bahrainis, we hear you, we share your miserable present, not the past. If you have your Ben Ali, we too have our Mubarak, and we all yearn to a different, better future. What bonded us was not a feeling of a shared past, based on some primordial blood connection, but a brighter future that we are struggling to imagine together. If I may be allowed one last self-indulgence in this nostalgic prelude, I want to stop briefly at what I felt was conspicuously absent from the early days of Tahrir. Nasser. It is true that there were a few who did carry Nasser's pictures during the 18 days. But these, I believe, in these 18 days, were a few die-hard Nasserites, probably from the nearby Nasser's party, whose headquarters is close by, only a few blocks away. And the more I thought about this absence, the more I thought that maybe what we were doing in January 2011, I believe, we finally managed to bury Nasser and to bid him farewell. In Tahrir, I believe we finally killed our father. But also I thought, 4.5 years later, Egypt is now ruled by a president who sees himself as Nasser incarnate. Moreover, he's a president who rides over a sea of popularity and adulating admiration. Egyptians, in their millions, are now willingly entreating their leader to take charge, be firm, and deliver them from their predicament. The self-confidence that characterized Tahrir in its early weeks and months, the quotidian, I mean, people are looking for are no more. Egyptian politics today is not informed by any of the lofty principles that moved the masses in the early months of 2011. More than 4 years later, Egypt finds itself today deeply divided under a regime that has killed more Egyptian citizens in a year than Mubarak has in 30 years. After serving few months behind bars, Mubarak, his sons, and many of their henchmen are now out of prison and have been completely rehabilitated. After a short but serious setback suffered by the police, the security and intelligence forces are back with a vengeance, arresting revolutionary figures, closing down the public sphere, and sentencing opposition figures to long prison sentences. Most importantly, the army, with its vast economic empire, is now firmly at the helm, its position secured not only by reclaiming the presidency, but by managing to protect its vast interests through an arsenal of laws and constitutional provisions that exempt it from any form of public scrutiny. Is Egypt back to square one? Was Tahrir then a mere phantom, a fleeting, ephemeral moment in Egypt's long history? Is the Arab Spring nothing but a bubble that burst soon after its formation? I do not think so. And I continue to believe that what we have witnessed, what we are witnessing in Egypt and elsewhere in the region, is of profound historic significance. It is true that Egypt has seen the spectacular success of a well-coordinated and masterfully executed counter-revolution. It is also true that events in Libya, in Syria, and in Yemen are infinitely more tragic and complicated. Even in Tunisia, arguably the most successful of the Arab Spring countries, the road to freedom and justice has proven to be very rough. Still, I strongly believe that the events of the Arab Spring, with the mass politicization of millions of citizens, and with the political, intellectual, and psychological crossing of many red lines, are irreversible. Indeed, what we are witnessing is only the beginning of what will surely be a long and arduous and bloody transition to democracy. A transition that, unlike Eastern Europe, will take many, many years, if not decades, to be accomplished. There is no going back. But I'm jumping the gun here and racing to my conclusion. First, I believe we need to understand what led to this dramatic outbreak in 2011 in the first place. Was this a mere Facebook revolution, led by a handful of techies who were surprised when their playful call to arms was answered by hundreds of thousands of Egyptians? Or did this revolution have deeper roots and other causes? Second, we need to understand how this dramatic reversal came about. Is what we have been witnessing in Egypt since July 2013 a military coup staged by the army against a democratically elected president? Or is it a much deeper counter-revolution staged by the so-called deep state, the military, the police, the bureaucracy, the judiciary, trying to recoup the ground that they have lost in January 2011? Naturally, constructing a narrative that attempts to answer these questions is a very fraught enterprise. And the struggle in Egypt, as elsewhere in the region, nowadays is as much about the historical narrative of the revolution as it is about the revolution itself. On its part, the current regime is struggling to come up with a narrative that stresses not the 25th of January 2011 as the pivotal moment that sparked the revolution, but the 30th of June 2013, the day it claimed 17 million, and another account 30 million Egyptians marched in the streets against the short-lived regime of Mohammed Morsi and Mubarak. According to this narrative, the revolutionaries of January 2011 were impressionable, naive youth at best, or foreign agents intent on bringing down not only the regime, but the entire state at worst. I will come back to this narrative towards the end of my talk. For the time being, though, I want to engage critically with another narrative that is more famous and familiar here in the West. According to this narrative, the revolution got off to a very promising start. A group of young, liberal, apparently Western educated or Western influenced youth rose up calling for an end to dictatorship, agitating for human rights, and demanding basic freedoms. Having managed to oust Mubarak from power, the true test came with the national and then the presidential elections. These elections, as we know, resulted not in the victory of these liberal secular youth forces, but of the Islamists. Crucial, this narrative adds. Rather than accept the result of the elections and prepare for the next round in 4 or 5 years' time, the revolutionaries betrayed their liberal values, reached out to the military, and started plotting to drive the Brotherhood out of power and to oust President Morsi, the first democratically elected Egypt has ever seen. The revolutionaries ended up being bad losers, according to this narrative. They appeared to struggle for democracy, but in truth, they failed to understand one of the cardinal principles of democracy, that of accepting the results of the ballot boxes and of safeguarding the peaceful transition to power. These young revolutionaries should not be surprised then, if after getting rid of the Islamists, the new regime now turns against them, rounds them up, stacks them in prison and detention centers, and inflicts on them a systematic torture policy that makes the legendary abuses under Mubarak fade by comparison. On the face of it, there is much truth in this narrative. One of the most painful things that we talk about all the time when we sit together, is to realize that some of those same people with whom we march shoulder to shoulder in Tahrir have reversed direction and ended up accepting the logic of the counter-revolution, and even among some of them ending up being some of its most eloquent ideologues. But apart from these flip-flops, and there are quite a few of them, I don't think that the narrative that says that the fault of the revolution for democracy lay with the undemocratic revolutionaries is completely accurate. Let me illustrate my point with a curious incident. And this is a self-indulging one, so you indulge me in my indulgence. Nearly 2 years ago, in early June 2013, the Muslim Brotherhood Minister of Culture appointed a new director of the Egyptian National Archives. The new director's name, for those of you who know the story, the new director's name was Khaled Fahmy. Someone who has been conducting research in the Egyptian National Archives for the past 20 years, and as someone who has repeatedly written about the National Archives, the wealth of information it has, and the need to open this treasure house to Egyptians, I started receiving phone calls congratulating me on the new position. The callers only wondered if I would accept to work under a Muslim Brotherhood Minister of Culture. I responded by saying that there must be a mistake, that the Khaled Fahmy they appointed as director of the Egyptian National Archives could not be me, is not me, but is actually another Khaled Fahmy, who is a professor of linguistics at Minnesota University, and who is indeed the Muslim Brotherhood sympathizer, although he's not a member of the group. I explained that under no circumstances would I accept a position under Muslim Brotherhood government or administration. What are you going to do then to confront this calamity? He asked me. What do you mean? Well, we can't allow the Muslim Brotherhood custodianship of our national history. They will tamper with the historical record. They will steal the documents related to their organization, especially the records of the political police investigating the historical crimes from the 1930s all the way to the 1960s. We need to stop them from stealing these documents, and the only way to do so is by asking the army to step in and protect the National Archives. Horrified, I replied, the army? How in goodness sake would a tank protect historical documents? Plus, these documents that you think the Muslim Brotherhood has its eye on has never actually been deposited in the National Archives. They're still in the custody of the Ministry of Interior. And we researchers have been fighting to have access to them for years. And assuming, for goodness sake, that we do indeed need to prevent the Muslim Brotherhood from tampering with the historical record, do we then go to the army for help? Am I hearing you correctly, Egyptian intellectuals, when you tell me that we want to ask the army to step in to protect Egyptian culture? The army which has shot at us in Tahrir, the army which has subjected our comrades to virginity tests, the army which has abducted the revolutionaries during the 18 days and tortured them in the Egyptian Museum, the army that had kidnapped revolutionary youth on highways and subjected them to surgical operations with no prophylaxis or anesthesia? You are beseeching this army to step in and save us from the Muslim Brotherhood? I wrote these alarm questions on Facebook, and then I repeated them in an article in a show, and then on a TV program. 2 days later, many of these same intellectuals, novelists, filmmakers, film critics, musicians, stormed into the Ministry of Culture, had a sit-in, and prevented the Muslim Brotherhood minister from having access to his office. After some hesitation, I decided to go in and join the sit-in and express my solidarity. Any peaceful sit-in that attempts to claim public space is something I support and continue to do so. The minute I stepped in, however, I was met with deep hostility. What is it that you wrote the other day on Facebook? And why are you so lenient on Khaled, the Muslim Brotherhood sympathizer? And why are you attacking the army so strongly? Don't you see that we have no recourse to rid us except the army, except the army? I then looked around the table and I saw many figures who have dominated the Egyptian cultural scene for decades. I asked them, do you really think that we cannot take on both the army and the Muslim Brotherhood at the same time? No, they answered in unison. Then we are indeed doomed, I thought. 2 days later, I got an invitation from Khaled Fahmy to speak at the National Archives, as I had predicted. I did not hesitate for a minute. This is my archives, years before he even knew about its existence, let alone set foot in it. I had two conditions, though. I choose the topic of my talk, and that the talk should be open to all, including the media. He agreed. I immediately contacted my friends to coordinate with them the plan of attack. They're also intellectuals, novelists, filmmakers, film critics, and musicians. But they're a different bunch from those in the Ministry of Culture. My intellectual friends are considerably younger, technologically savvy, and infinitely more self-confident, having never relied on the institutions of the state for their intellectual production. I wrote my lecture, and I shared it with them in advance. They made significant, and it turned out to be key successful observations. Finally, we all went to the National Archives, controlled by the Muslim Brotherhood sympathizer Khaled Fahmy, but claimed Khaled Fahmy, not the historian, And I insisted, I'm a citizen. I am here as a citizen, not as a student. My friends came up with the mobile phones, iPads, and hashtags. Khaled Fahmy versus Khaled. This screen was a evolving screen to say Khaled Fahmy, the head of the archives, welcomes Khaled Fahmy. You see his story. My message was simple but clear. I told my host that I had no problem with him, that I had a problem with him not because of his affiliation, but because of his politics. The question is not one of identity, but of rights. The Egyptian National Archives, I informed its new director, has close to 100 million records. The average number of visitors per day is 8. What have you done to rectify this problem? You have given in to popular pressure in order to assuage public opinion who is fearful that you might tamper with the historical record. You actually have tightened rather than loosened access to the archives. To have access to the archives, you have to have a security permit from each. That's the reason why we have 8 visitors a day. It may not be 8, it may be 12. And you have even written to the army, asking the generals to appoint a high-ranking military officer, expert in documents, to oversee the place, the votes. I concluded by saying, if you reverse your recent decisions, tightening access to the archives, and if you open the archives to the Egyptian public, I will be the first to come and congratulate you on your new post. Otherwise, I and my friends will continue to criticize you for the deeply undemocratic policies you are applying. My host thanked me politely and then decided to walk out before the Q&A. I'm sharing this story with you not to dwell on what I said in my encounter with my namesake, but to highlight the difference in attitude between these two sets of intellectuals, those whom I encountered in the sit-in in the Ministry of Culture and those who came with me to the National Archives. Apart from the significant point of the age difference between them, I think that what marks them most is their respected attitude towards the Egyptian state and its institutions, and by implication towards democracy and human rights. The first group of intellectuals, those I met in the Ministry of Culture sit-in, believe that the state and its institutions, the National Archives, the National Library, the National Theatre, the Cairo Ballet Company, the Cairo Opera House, they believe these institutions to be theirs. And they were quite alarmed when they saw the Muslim Brotherhood laying their hands on them. In the struggle to wrest control of these institutions, they deployed a discourse of identity and authenticity. Egyptian identity is complex, they said, multifaceted and diverse. We will not allow it to be hijacked by a group that champions an un-Egyptian version of Islam, a version influenced by a Wahhabi Bedouin culture. We will do everything possible to prevent the Brotherhood from altering the true, authentic character of Egypt. By doing so, they inadvertently ended up being the servants of the state rather than its custodians. And more importantly, they necessarily, and I argue, consciously adopted a condescending attitude towards the Egyptian people. Egypt is in danger, and Egyptian culture is at stake, they kept on saying. But they never asked themselves how best to serve the Egyptian people or how to make these cultural institutions accessible to the public. By contrast, the younger group of intellectuals who accompanied me to the Egyptian archives were more concerned with rights than with identity. For them, the Egyptian state and its institutions should serve the Egyptian people rather than the other way around. They saw no essential differences between the Muslim Brotherhood director of the National Archives and his predecessors, who were equally dismissive of the right of Egyptians to knowledge and to information. At the core of this revolution, this is one of the nicest things very early on, someone writing on these walls. At the very core of this revolution has always been this question: whose state is it, and how can we reform it? Those who control the state, that is the high brass of the army, the leading police and security generals, the judges, the government bureaucrats, the big business who need the protection and lucrative deals of the state, and also the intellectuals, the writers, journalists, and academics who cannot function except under the umbrella of the state. All these functionaries of the deep state were alarmed at the mere mention of this question: whose state is it? And accused those who raised it of being anarchists willing to do away with the state altogether. Instead, we were effectively saying that if we believe that the state's main purpose to serve the people rather than itself, then the Egyptian state has been a failed state for the past 60 years, if not longer. And there is no way to reform it except by bringing down the regime that is holding it together. The mass demonstrations that broke out in January 2011 might have been triggered by the regime's machinations to hand over the presidency to Mubarak's son, Gamal. But they had much deeper structural reasons. On an immediate level, it was not an accident that the revolution broke out on the 25th of January, Police Day. This was a clear sign that the people had finally broken the fear barrier and decided to put an end themselves to the endemic and systematic use of torture in prisons and other places of detention. On a deeper level, the demonstrations also raised the slogan of social justice, a key demand from day one of the revolution. Despite years of economic restructuring, and despite what the government has said were clear signs of its economic success, the mass of Egyptians did not benefit from these supposed improvements. Suffice to say that according to the United Nations World Food Programme, the percentage of Egyptians living below the poverty line rose from 40% in 2005 to 40% in 2005 to 31% in 2011 for children between the ages of 6 months and 5 years. As a result, socio-economic protests were on the rise since 2004, way before the outbreak of the revolution in 2011. In fact, socio-economic protests were the only persistent factor in Egyptian politics since 2004. Deeper still, I believe, Egyptians rose in a mass revolt to reject the debased populist authoritarian formula that the Egyptian state has been offering us since 1952, giving up political and constitutional rights in exchange for economic entitlements. It was this condescending attitude of the patronizing state that the Egyptians, I think, revolted against. In other words, this was no Facebook revolution planned and staged by a handful of funky liberal actors. This revolution had its deep socioeconomic roots that touched large strata in society that went back at least 2004, if not much earlier. The young and not so young men and women who appeared to lead the revolution in 2011 were not its makers, its leaders, or its planners. They were not conspirators with foreign agendas as the current regime is struggling to depict them. They were only merely citizens who strove together with millions across the country to hold the state accountable and to force it to serve them rather than the other way around. These revolutionaries managed to pry open the political scene and to allow the people to have their say. For the first time in 60 years, we had free and fair elections. Elections which, as I said before, were won not by those revolutionaries, but by Islamists. Earlier, this revolutionary camp, and I could include myself in it, was dismayed by the Islamist victory in the parliamentary elections of 2011 and the presidential elections the following year. But our dismay, at least my dismay, did not stem from an aversion of the Muslim Brotherhood's identity policies, although I find them occasionally objectionable, but because of the inherently undemocratic, authoritarian nature of the Muslim Brotherhood. And when we took to the streets a year later, on the 30th of June 2013, we were not calling for the army to step in, but we were struggling to put an end to the Brotherhood rule by calling for early elections. Specifically, I, for one, was deeply opposed to 3 grave mistakes that the Muslim Brotherhood committed in their year in office, mistakes that proved to be fatal. When Mohammed Morsi won the presidency in June 2012 with a mere 51.7% of the vote, I expected him to understand the implications of this figure. He did have a mandate, and a legitimate one, it is true, but Egypt was deeply divided, and his prime duty should have been to close its rifts. Morsi should have worked hard to include the opposition in the key decisions facing his troubled country. Instead, he adopted a hard-line, exclusive approach and trusted no one but the most extreme of his group, the Muslim Brotherhood. Second, Morsi and his Muslim Brotherhood clung to the narrowest definitions of legitimacy, that which derives from the ballot box, and failed to realize that there was still revolution in the streets, on the streets, and that this revolution had two items on its agenda: bringing the army under civilian control and undertaking a serious process of security sector reform. Morsi and his Muslim Brotherhood miserably failed to tackle either of these important tasks. Most crucially, the constitution, which was written by the president's organization and the other Islamist allies, failed to subject the military budget to parliamentary oversight, stipulate that the Minister of Defense be civilian, or end the flawed process whereby civilians are tried in front of military tribunals. Similarly, Morsi has taken no measures whatsoever to reform the security sector. All proposals to reform that sector were forcefully snubbed by Morsi's government. Not a single police officer accused of torture under Mubarak's strong reign was brought to justice. The culture of impunity within the Ministry of Interior was not rectified, and torture continued to be practiced in Egyptian prisons, jails, and other places of detention. Thirdly, Morsi and other leaders of the Muslim Brotherhood did not realize that the tactics they perfected to win elections are not suitable to run a country. The stealth and cultish attitude with which they understood and practiced politics might have allowed them to maintain their cohesiveness for 8 years in the face of untold government brutality. But running a country required compromise, building trust, dealing with outsiders. Above all, it required a non-condescending attitude towards Egyptians, something that the Brotherhood failed to understand. I mean, those who say that the Brotherhood failed to deliver economically, and that is why they lost the confidence of the people, I think I'm missing the point. I don't think anyone actually expected the Muslim Brotherhood to solve Egypt's economic problems. It is this condescending attitude, and I remember this thing, and I think it's very telling. One day I took a cab in the midst of the sit-in, the Rab'a sit-in and another sit-in, and the driver was saying, you know, I just dropped one of them. I said, of who? He said, of the Brotherhood. I said, so? And he said, well, you know, the fare was £5. So he gave me £10. And when I was about to return the change, he said, no, keep it and pray for Morsi. So what do you think I did? I accepted it, of course. It's money for my kids. رزق جاي العيال. But pray for Morsi? Why? Is he bribing me? I think that sums it up. This is a sentiment I have witnessed and I've heard in many parts. It's not only in Cairo. In Fayoum and Asyut, my friends are telling me the same thing. A Muslim Brotherhood and the big vote for the Salafis, at least as far as Fayoum is concerned, was effectively a protest vote against the Muslim Brotherhood. And it is this kind of attitude that we are better, we can tell you what to do, we can look down on you. The tragedy of the Egyptian revolution does not stem from the revolutionaries turning their back on democracy, cutting corners, and asking the militaries to step in to get rid of their force. When we took to the streets on June 30th, 2013, we believed that this was yet another stage in our long struggle for freedom, and that we needed to challenge the Muslim Brotherhood regime that did not share our revolutionary principles and that was not keen to fight with us against the deep state. The tragedy of the Egyptian revolution also does not stem from its lacking a Rousseau or Lenin, who could tell us what is to be done. Throughout the past 3 years, the past 4 years, and more importantly, over the 8 or so years preceding the revolution, Egyptian bloggers, human rights activists, and journalists, all in their late 20s and early 30s, have left no aspect of Egyptian public life unstudied and have tackled issues that had been taboo in Egypt throughout the 60 years of no politics. I can mention Amr Izzat, for example, of Al-Masri Bureau, a former Salafi and a member of the Brotherhood, who wrote some of the best critiques of the systematic violation of religious freedoms. Hamad Abu Ghait, one of the best investigative reporters Egypt has ever produced, who has uncovered many cases of corruption and embezzlement. Wa'il Abbas and Wa'il Abd-Fattah, whose blogs and newspaper articles about torture have shed light on the horrors taking place in Egypt's dungeons. Wa'il Gamal and Amr Adli, who systematically studied the Egyptian economy, highlighting the structural problems it suffers from and shedding light on the deep corruption and ineptitude that plague it. Ismail al-Iskandarani, who had gradually risen as an expert on Sinai and of the deep social, economic and security problems that the peninsula is suffering from. Hossein Bahgat, founding director of the Egyptian Initiative for Personal Rights, arguably one of the best human rights organizations in Egypt, if not in the whole region. Reem Saad, a close friend of mine, who nearly single-handedly launched a campaign against capital punishment in Egypt. Islam Hussein, who courageously strove to uncover the blatant, indeed criminal lies that the top brass of Egypt's military had committed in what came to be known as the Kofta Gate, the cure for AIDS. Amr Gharbeya, an IT specialist who has worked tirelessly to draft a new freedom of information law and to revise the entire philosophy governing the citizens' right to information. In addition to a host of other activists and organizations that have produced incisive pieces on sexual harassment, the economic empire of the army, the inherent structural problems plaguing the economy, the corruption that run deep in Egyptian bureaucracy, including within the very same agencies that are supposed to monitor corruption. The tragedy of the Egyptian revolution does not stem from the revolutionaries failing to do what the transitologists advised us to do. Soon after Mubarak was deposed, droves of those transitologists came to Egypt to advise us and to lecture us on the three waves of democracy and advise us on how to make a smooth transition. First, you have to establish a multi-party system and have free elections, they told us. Then we have to make sure the political landscape is dominated by reformists and populated by robust political parties. Strengthen your constitutional court, they told us. Make sure you go through a thorough lustration policy to ensure a successful process of transitional justice. Fight hard to allow for the formation of institutes and new intellectual elite. Yes, I went to numerous of these meetings, both in Egypt and elsewhere, by people who were very well intentioned, who had very good points, but I had the distinct feeling that they were coming from a different planet. No, the tragedy of the Egyptian revolution is not due to the lack of courage or the dearth of ideas. If the revolutionaries are to be blamed of anything, it is their failure to seize the opportunity of the opening they themselves effected in January 2011, and which Tahrir epitomized in order to build networks, reach out to skeptics, devise practical, enforceable solutions, and offer themselves to the wider public, not only as revolutionaries, intent on bringing down the regime, but also as responsible politicians who could be entrusted with the unenviable task of government. But again, I say, when we're hounded in the streets, when we waste our time between the morgue and the funeral and the police station, how on earth were we supposed to build these coalitions, come up with these concrete plans? Despite this valid criticism, I would not like to be too harsh on these revolutionaries. A healthy dose of self-criticism is welcome, but I think it is dangerous to split into self-flagellation. After all, the real tragedy is that the revolution found itself sandwiched between the army and the Muslim Brotherhood. The real tragedy of the revolution is that having forced Mubarak to step down and having succeeded in calling for fresh parliamentary and presidential elections, it was neither the remnants of the old regime nor the young democratic revolutionaries who ended up winning the elections. Rather, it was Islamists who ended up dominating parliament and winning the presidency. The problem with Islamists is not that they believe in an inauthentic Wahhabi Islam, or that they were hell-bent on altering Egyptian identity, as many of their detractors claimed. The problem with Islamists is that they believe neither in democracy nor in the revolution. Unlike Eastern Europe, therefore, our tragedy did not simply lie in the race for time to prevent the ancien regime from regathering its forces and staging a comeback. We were confronting that danger or right. But in addition, we found ourselves also dealing with a completely different set of challenges, namely the whole question of political Islam, the Muslim Brotherhood Salafi alliance, both with their victim. It is this tripartite division, the military, the Islamists. In this tripartite division, the military and the Islamists colluded together against us. And after the military decided to drop their former partners, they turned on us with a relentless vengeance. What made this ferocious counter-revolution possible are two factors related to the regional conflicts that, again, mark Egypt off from the numerous countries of Eastern Europe. The first, The first is the significant role played by the oil-rich countries of the Gulf, but also the regional context. The military, with its intelligence services and news outlets, very clearly and very cleverly manipulated the images coming out of Libya, Syria, and Iraq to coax millions of Egyptians into cursing the revolution and accusing the revolutionaries of playing with fire and dangerously pushing the country to the brink. After months of political unrest, an economy teetering on complete collapse, and the disastrous year of the Muslim Brotherhood rule, Egyptians found themselves gripped by fear to the degree of complete paralysis. Like the deer in the headlights, Egyptians in the millions pleaded with the army to step in and to save their country from what they were led to believe the revolutionaries had in store for them, breaking the country apart. After undertaking draconian measures against the Muslim Brotherhood, measures that saw hundreds of followers massacred on the streets and hundreds more sentenced to death in kangaroo trials, the counter-revolution is now directing its full wrath against the democratic revolutionaries, arresting them, sending them to prison, and gradually regaining ground that they had lost since 2011. The Arab Spring, at least as far as Egypt is concerned, is looking less like 1989 and more like 1848. Like the 19th century European revolutions that were dubbed the springtime of nations, the Egyptian revolution has suffered a serious setback. The road ahead is bleak and difficult. The immediate future, I believe, will carry more crackdowns, more arrests, more silencing, all in the name of restoring stability and fighting terrorism. As in this country, immediately after 9/11, anyone who's not towing the government line is now deemed to be unpatriotic, to be working with them and not with us, to be a suspect, to be a traitor. Press freedoms are significantly curtailed, legal and constitutional rights seriously undermined, and the country is now poised to get embroiled in a regional war that can only bring more hardship. With no sitting parliament and with the press effectively silenced, there is nothing that prevents further violations of the Constitution and further erosion of basic rights. Found ourselves, when we took to Tahrir and we found ourselves being from Eastern Europe. The other thing is what I alluded to earlier, and maybe can elaborate on it further. I think I had a distinct feeling that with Eastern Europe there was, from 89 onwards, a belief that there was in the history a period, a certain moment in the past that we can go back to. If only we can wipe communism, and maybe Nazism, and imagine, of course all of this is imagined, with a lot of force, a lot of violence, but also creativity. Then maybe we can all agree as Poles or Czechs that, this is our new point from which we can jumpstart our history. In Egypt, we don't have it. We don't have such a moment. We are not, Nasser is popular among many people, but go and suggest today, or 5 years ago, or 10 years ago, or 30 years ago, that you would name Cairo airport after Nasser. Inconceivable. There's no consensus on him. And of course, there's no consensus on the monarchy, let alone on anything earlier. So there is nothing, this is one of the crises that we are facing. There's no moment nationally where we can say, this is the good moment in which the nation got together, it got distorted, so let us wipe out the distortion, go back to our original point, and start afresh. And that, I think, is another fundamental difference with Eastern Europe. And those advisors were not sensitive to this, they were not listening to us when we kept on telling them, we are facing something different, and we are facing a deeper problem. It's not Nasser, it's not despotism, it's not Mubarak, it's not Al-Adi, it's not torture. It's something much deeper that we're trying to fix. We don't really know what it is, but it's there, it's deep, and we're trying to grapple with in the midst of all of what we're struggling with. With regards to the brotherhood, no, I think with regards to the expertise, there are 2 points. I think that the brotherhood, one of the, I personally, I have enormous sympathy. If I were, looking at, not only since Rabaa and the massacres, but even before, in the revolution, caught the brotherhood in an existentially threatening moment. And it posed an existential threat to them, even setting aside the military, even without what happened afterwards, with all the massacres and all the blood and all the torture. Because what they were basically asked to do is to renounce two things. One is to recognize something that is very difficult to recognize, that the Brotherhood had not produced a single interesting, positive idea since Sayyid Qutb. This is, for a political movement, this is a catastrophe. For it not, unlike the Islamists in Turkey, unlike the Islamists in Tunisia, unlike the Islamists elsewhere, Egyptian Islamists have been very, very intellectually bankrupt for the past generation. And secondly, they failed to, so how do you catch up with this when you have actually not done your homework? And this became very evident. I mean, when we went and sat with them, we were stunned. The ministers now and the deputy ministers, they know very little about the Egyptian economy. They have no experience, and they have no information, and they have no conception. They know nothing about the economy. About running the economy, they can run businesses, but they cannot run the economy. But psychologically, I really sympathize, because this is an organization that has been hounded for 80 years, and suddenly they are at the head. And to switch, to make this switch, to recognize that you are now the authority, which is difficult, of course, because they are targeted by the security forces and by the streets. It is true. That is a very difficult position to be in. That's another tragedy. But that is the responsibility of being in power. And instead of owning up, they still clung to their victim mentality. We are being targeted. The opposition is opposing us. Well, yes, that's the role of the opposition. It's supposed to make your life miserable. That is what they're going to do. And of course, they made our life very easy by the mistakes they committed. So, but they did not realize the time, like the Tunisian Muslims, the time now is for coalition and to reach out and make compromises. And I'll tell you, I wrote an article, I don't know whether, I'm not ashamed of it. I wrote an article in the summer of 2011 that said, time to reach a deal with the Islamists against the army. I was attacked by my friends. The Islamists, the Brotherhood, especially an apology. I had to write an apology. They did not make my life easier. The Brotherhood, did not. And I was willing to say, let's conceivably think. and the number of blunders that they committed. But I'll tell you one last thing. This thing about the freedom of information. Finally, the Minister of Justice agreed to sit with us under the Muslim Brotherhood presidency. And we gathered our team. Hussein was there, Amr Rabia was there, and Huda Safa, the most soft-spoken of us. And we sat there and we said, okay, it was very good that the minister himself agreed to come and sit with us. It means that he's giving this question his priority. He came and sat and lectured us for 1 whole hour, accusing the revolution and the youth and the press for trying to bring down the regime. And then ended up with half an hour denying that there is torture.
This is the Minister of Justice.
Yes.
What was his name?
Nick. And we were stunned. This was uncalled for. We had gone to speak about freedom of information. This is an explosive issue to speak about torture. We had already made the compromise. We had already decided to work with them. We had already decided to be part of the team. We had gone, having done our homework, only to be confronted by this. This was uncalled for. So Hoda stood up and said, you know, Your Excellency, I'm meeting mothers of victims of police brutality later today. What am I going to tell you? That the Minister of Justice denies that your kids have been killed? How can I confront them? I'm very sorry, I cannot accept what you said. And we stormed out. We said, I mean, we were boiling up, and once she said this, it all exploded, and we said, we're very sorry, we cannot sit on the same table with the Minister of Justice, not the Minister of Interior, who is denying that there is torture, when we know that, you know, this is happening in Cairo. So I think they failed big time, and they committed many unnecessary blunders. This, of course, is no way to condone what is happening to them now.
Yeah, I don't disagree with you that they failed miserably. However, I'm just saying that we shouldn't deny the role they played in the revolution, because in your recounting of the events, you did not mention
okay, this is one point I wanted to address. I'm glad you're reminding me. No, of course they did. And the so-called famous Battle of the Camel in Tahrir would not have been repulsed had the Brotherhood not been there, the rank and file. The leadership was reluctant. The members came, I'm not denying this, and some of them did heroic things. And as I said, that revolution, I did not believe in the principles of the revolution the way I put it down. And they thought, they agreed with the revolution so long as the revolution resulted in elections. And their mistake was to think that after elections, everybody should go home. They did not realize that people had grievances, and that we did not risk our lives to have new players. We risked our lives to have new rules of the game, not new players. And they wanted to keep the same rules intact.
The counter-revolutionaries, and not necessarily think of the people as people who can make different choices at different times. And we, as in the revolutionaries, tend to put less blame on ourselves, as you were very sort of honest. And the fact that we failed to deliver packages to impact the choices of the people, and to get out of the trap of fighting the country, the counter-revolutions, and offer the people something that they might eventually choose. So now we tend to go for the ideal and do things as they should be done. For myself, I've been a member in 3 movements at different times of revolution, but never political party, because I was told that this is not the thing I want.
I got your point.
So without organization and with the counter-revolutionaries very active and very well organized, how do you see the role of the liberal voices or the activists you've been talking about to make a game changer?
Yeah, so I have one question addressing 2 points perfectly. You wish to address both points or any?
You can speak up so that people can
Okay.
hear you better.
So I think part of the success of the Arab Spring is owed to it being a regional phenomenon. So I think there has been some learning for the Egyptian regime or the Egyptian government lately in terms of attempting to join some sort of regime security umbrella, especially when it comes to the Gulf countries, trying to be protected as a regime externally. So this is one point. The second point is there has been some debate lately on some sort of discussion in society about on religion, the role of religion in society. There seems to be some tension, and Azhar being very defensive about it as an institution, and the president in the beginning calling for some sort of revolution and then being a bit silent, which may seem to suggest acceptance of this sort of debate. Now the question for both is, do you see these two things as an opportunity or a threat for the domestic revolutionary forces that we may say?
Shall I, yeah, very quickly. Okay. Very quickly. No, I take your point, obviously. I take your point that the revolutionaries did not, I mean, I was against the Tahrir Square when it dragged on, turning people against the youth. And, you know, like, this is going on for such a long time without being sensitive to the Hizb Canada, being dismissive of people who are fearful, being dismissive of people whose livelihoods were threatened and actually devastated. But then sometimes I also think what would have happened had the revolutionaries done what people wanted them to do. Get your act together, unify your voices, and present clear alternative answers. Given the situation on the streets, had this happened, it would not be Baradei or Ahmed Khattab or Khaled Fahmy. It would be a Robespierre who would have seized the enormous rage on the street. I mean, imagine someone from the ultras managing to harness this amazing force and unify it and say, we'll go to the end. We'll storm the Ministry of Interior and the presidential palace. What we will have seen in Tahrir would be girls. I have no doubt that that would be the result. So I actually respect somebody like Ziad al-Alimi and others who very early on saw the danger of this and say, do not turn us into heroes. We do not want to be heroes. I mean, that is the dilemma. They saw the potential. Many of these people could have stepped in and seized the opportunity of the anger on the street, the collapse of the central authority, and go for it, not in a grassroots way, but so I say, you know, beware what you wish for. That would have been a very dangerous thing indeed. Now, with regards to your question, because the regional context and I actually think that, frankly, now is the moment to continue work. I mean, we're only beginning, we're only starting. The regional context, including learning from Tunisia, reaching out what's happening in Syria. This because we are so self-obsessed. We have so little time and so little energy to devote to what is happening elsewhere, despite the fact that this is genuinely a regional phenomenon. The same with your question about religion. I mean, but again, I come back to say that the atmosphere in which we now work in Egypt is impossible. It's very difficult. It's much worse than before. So, listening to the president saying we need a religious revolution and saying this in Al-Azhar, I could not agree more. But that's not the way to do it. You cannot go to a group of scholars and tell them produce now, tomorrow, we need something with you. That's not how it works, as you know. That's not how it works. If you need a genuine religious revolution, allow the revolutionaries to speak, open up, and allow people to debate and challenge. I mean, what I was actually, what I cut out from my talk, what I was telling Khaled Fahmy is, and my students here know, we're reading something about the archives in Egypt. The archives in Egypt has amazing information about the history of Sharia in Egypt that I think, this is what I told him. I said, you know, here in this building, there are about 8,000 registers of a very complicated legal system that coexisted with the Sharia courts, that if one were to study them correctly, one would have a very different notion of what it means to apply Sharia than what you think Sharia is. It's a long sentence, but it took me some time to explain and to him. And I said, I did this, it took me 15 years, but it should not be a project of one person. This is the National Archives. Turn it into an institution that generates knowledge. Open it up so that instead of having 8 people in the reading room, you have 100 people, and that by the end of the year, instead of having one PhD dissertation produced from this work, you'll have 10 or 15. That is your job. But in this, he's not different from any other director of the National Archives, including the current one. The National Archives is the archives of the state. And the policy with which the president now goes to Al-Azhar and tells the scholars produce is that same mentality. I want something in particular, otherwise I don't want you. And that is not how you that is not how you affect a religious revolution. You affect a religious revolution through allowing ideas to be generated and to be contested, and those who believe in certain ideas about political Islam to be challenged. And Layla knows this, to be challenged on their ground. That is how you do it. So I think now is the time. So yes, I agree with you. It's an opportunity as much as it is a crisis.
I'm going to take this opportunity actually to say that was a good note to end on, and to thank everybody for coming, and to say that we have a little reception, so if you want to talk
of an active opposition, a more active opposition that was involved in governing. And I think it's a little bit unfair to judge their performance in lack of this part of the importance of their setup. It's not fair to just say that they were condescending.
Okay, let me address these 2 questions as quickly and as thoroughly as I can. The first question, yeah, I mean, that is the problem I encountered when I met these well-intentioned advisors. That they had a model in mind, and it's mostly an